Hey guys, it's me, Elephants Are Tasty, and I'm finally here with the results of my RWBY Fights survey. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, earlier this week I conducted a survey regarding RWBY and what the community thinks of the show's fights. So basically, I was inspired to do this because the community has been super bad, like the fandom has been super bad for a while, and a lot of the complaints sometimes are the lack of good fights. It started out just as a question on Reddit, but then I realized I could turn it into something more. I asked the RWBY subreddit, what are your favorite fights in RWBY? Because I was curious, are the people complaining about the more recent fights in the more recent volumes just a vocal minority, or do a lot of people actually agree with them and think that way? So what I was doing, I'll get more into the details in a second, but basically I asked people what their favorite fights in RWBY were, and then I kind of compiled the data, took down which volumes each fight was in, and then I made a bunch of like graphs. You'll see some pie charts, cute pictures, whatever. So hopefully this is interesting, and hopefully this provides a little bit of insight into the RWBY fandom, the community, and what people think about the show. Okie dokie guys, so I compiled a kind of report document, as you can see on your screen. Later I'll give y'all the link so you can see this whenever you want. But basically I'm going to go through all that I have and then maybe talk about some of the results at the end. And I definitely want to hear what you guys think of all this, so don't forget to leave a comment, let me know what you think. Just any ideas, any whatever you want to talk about, just leave a comment. I'll probably reply because I have nothing better to do apparently. Anyway, let's get into it. So this is my RWBY Favorite Fight Survey 2019 by me! So basically most of this I'm just going to read directly off what I wrote and then maybe discuss it a little bit. So, my question for this survey. Based on ample community comments, I have come across the quality of fights in RWBY, quote, haven't been good in a while. For example, take a Reddit comment that was left in my survey. I liked all the fights up to season 3, sharp drop in quality after that. So this made me wonder, is this a universal opinion within the community or just a very vocal minority? What are the community's favorite fights, and are they really in the earlier volumes? For the survey, I asked the question, what are your all-time favorite fights in the entirety of RWBY, or some equivalent variation, to users of 3 social media platforms, Reddit, Twitter, and Facebook. So in a second I'm going to talk about some potential issues of this survey, so I'll explain the question a bit more then. I asked the Rooster Teeth and RWBY subreddits, members of 2 RWBY Facebook groups that I was already in, and I made the question accessible to everyone on Twitter. However, no formatted polling formats were used, so like a Google survey or Facebook polls, I did not use those. I allowed people to put in completely free-form answers. My own answers are not included in these results, and I took answers on the survey from February 3rd to February 5th. I obviously would have liked to do longer, but if I started posting repetitively on the subreddits, on Twitter, etc., people would probably get annoyed, and I don't have the biggest social media presence, so it's not like I was getting a constant influx of responses. So that's why the survey time was pretty short. I allowed respondents to pick as many fights as they wanted and counted each of their choices in the results, unless they gave a vague answer such as any fight with X character or any fight from volume Y. In that case, I usually ask for more specific answers, but in some instances I would forget or lose track because I'm not perfect and this isn't a very scientific study. So if I got more specific answers, I included them in the results. Answers were only taken from explicit comments, not upvotes or likes on someone else's comments. And additionally, if someone's comment/vote was unclear and I did not get a clarification, their votes were not counted in the results. So just a note, one vote, like when I say the word vote, I'm meaning that one person mentioned that fight as one of their all-time favorites, and when I say most favorite fights, I'm talking about the fight with the most overall votes, unless I specify otherwise. I felt it would be important to identify some potential issues with this survey, just to let y'all know the limitations of the survey. As I mentioned before, my question was, what are your favorite fights, not which fights had the best choreography, and not which fights were the best. I thought this would be the easiest question for people to answer, and I do think that there's some overlap. There would be overlap in the answers anyway. I thought that asking this simple question would provide me with a general idea of which fights were the best according to the community. So take this survey with a grain of salt if you're explicitly looking for which fights have the highest quality. However, I would like to acknowledge that if a fight has lower quality, less people are likely to have it as a favorite unless there's some really strong emotional aspect in the fight. I think I talk about that more later. I honestly forget. I'm just reading through this again. But basically, I took it at face value. I was like, if someone's favorite fight is this fight, I'm just gonna take it as it's probably a high quality fight, which strongly contributes to why it's on this person's favorites list. I also combined some fights into one response, such as just Yellow Trailer or Ruby and Juniper versus Grimm. A full list of combined responses I'll talk about in a second, and this could lead to some potential skewing of results, but I did this in order to not let the number of responses get out of hand or become too hard to keep track of. And additionally, there could have been some overlap between social media platforms. Someone who answered on Reddit could have answered in the Facebook group, for example. I would have little to no way of knowing this, like knowing who is who, especially when dealing with Reddit, so the results have not been standardized or altered in any way to account for this. The final limitation that I have identified is episodes of RWBY often reach like several millions of views, and there are many fans of the show all around the world. I had a very small sample size compared to the number of fans of the show. While those who answered my survey were fairly random, keep this in mind, it doesn't represent a huge percentage of the fandom, obviously, but I thought it was more of like a random sample, but it's people who would be more willing to post answers on the internet. It's hard to explain right now, but just I have no way of knowing exactly how well everyone who answered represents the entire community. Okay, so last thing before we get into it, here's the list of fights I just all combined into one. Yellow Trailer, Ruby and Juniper versus Giant Nevermore Deathstalker, Blake and Sun versus Roman and the White Fang, all the Grimm fights in Breach, which was the Volume 2 finale, all the students including Velvet and Weiss versus the Rogue Mechs at the end of Volume 3, Battle of Beacon, Ranger and Crow versus Tyrion, because some people just specified Crow versus Tyrion, but I just kind of combined them because there's like some melding into them. And then there's the entire main floor Haven battle, which there is, I think, a couple, maybe 1 or 2 exceptions to this, which I forgot to write in here actually, so now that I'm talking about it, I've identified that, which is good, so I'll let y'all know. There were a couple people, 1 or 2 maybe, I forget the exact number, that mentioned something like Jean versus Cinder at Haven. I didn't include that as the entire main floor Haven battle. That was more meant for once everything really went to shit and everyone started fighting, and then like Cinder and Raven and them went downstairs, if that makes any sense. I also combined all of the fights in the Adam character short. I combined Blake and Yang versus Adam, and Ruby, Weiss, Oscar, Ren, Nora, Jean, Crow, and Maria versus Cordovan in her mech at the end of Volume 6. So those are all the fights I combined. I hopefully didn't forget anything. So now I think we're ready to move on to the actual results. The total number of responses I got on this survey was actually 100, and I didn't know it was going to be this nice of a number until I actually closed down the survey and counted how many responses I got, so like that's a decent number. I got 45 responses on Reddit, 28 responses on Facebook, and 27 responses on Twitter. The volume with the most favorite fights, the most different favorite fights that were individually put on people's favorite lists was Volume 3 with 13 different fights. Tied for second is Volume 6 and Volume 2. Tied for fourth is 5 and 1. And the volume with the fewest favorite fights is Volume 4. And then here is a very apparently pixelated list of just all of the different responses that people gave me during the survey. So I'm just kind of scrolling through this so y'all can see. Some of the words got cut off, but hopefully you can tell what I'm trying to deal with. Yes, see, in Volume 4 there's only 3 fights. And then here I specified Jean versus Cinder differently from main floor Haven battle. And someone actually voted for, if you can see my mouse, someone voted for Crow punching Ozpin / Oscar in Volume 6 as a fight, and I was like, I'm not gonna leave it out, like it's fine. So, now we're getting into the real results, and first we're going to reveal what overall the fight with the most votes, the internet's or the fandom's favorite fight is. Voila! Is it surprising? The favorite fight overall identified in my survey, so the fight with the most votes, is Blake and Yang versus Adam at the end of Volume 6. It received 47 votes, which means 47 out of 100 people identified this fight as one of their favorite all-time fights in RWBY. And that's definitely not surprising. However, I did immediately think of the strong emotional context of this fight. I definitely thought personally that the choreography was much improved from other fights in Volumes 4 or 5. However, I do know that there's a strong emotional context to this fight, like I said, so that could potentially be a confounding variable if you're actually looking for which fights are the best quality. Now we're going to talk about the favorite fights for each individual volume. So the favorite fight for Volume 1 was RWBY and Juniper versus the Giant Nevermore and Deathstalker. 17 votes were cast for this fight, so 17 people had this fight as a favorite. Volume 2's favorite fight was the food fight with 28 votes, which was actually a little surprising to me, but I can definitely see why. The people's favorite fight of Volume 3 was Pyrrha versus Cinder, which had 13 votes. The favorite fight of Volume 4, of course, was Ranger and Crow versus Tyrion, which had 25 votes. And Volume 5's favorite fight was Raven versus Cinder with 26 votes. And of course, Volume 6's favorite fight, does that make sense? The favorite fight of Volume 6 was Blake and Yang versus Adam, again with 47 votes. I just wanted to put down which fights actually only got 1 vote, which means 1 out of 100 people have these fights in their favorites. So Volume 1, Ren versus King Taiji, Penny versus Roman and the White Fang. Y'all can kind of read this. There are a couple tournament fights in there, and a couple of the fights in Volume 6 that were a bit more minor compared to the other big events that happened in this volume. The single character in most people's favorite fights was RWBY. However, this category is measured by the number of different fights mentioned, not necessarily how many votes those fights got. RWBY was in 16 out of the 48 different fights mentioned by the 100 respondents. Other characters in 10 or more of people's favorite fights were Weiss with 14, Blake with 12, Yang with 14, and Ren with 10, though I think Ren snuck in there because one person voted for Ren versus King Taiji. I mean, it counts as a data point, so that's why I put that in there. Then we have the single character in most favorite fights by total number of votes. So for this one, I gave every character a point for each vote they got for a fight they were in. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm super bad at explaining stuff, so hopefully this whole video makes any sense. But the single character in most favorite fights by number of total votes is Yang with 166 votes. That's not surprising. She's in a lot of great fights like Blake and Yang versus Adam, Yang versus Neo, Team RWBY versus Roman in the mech, stuff like that. Look at her, she's so majestic. The full team in most favorite fights is Team RWBY, which isn't actually surprising. People love it when Team RWBY works together, as they are the main characters of the show. Team RWBY worked together in a total of 6 different fights that were mentioned by the people who responded to the survey, and in total those 6 fights got 32 votes. So, people's favorite character short was the yellow trailer with Yang with 9 votes. However, this is a pretty low number, so a lot of people actually didn't mention any character trailers or character shorts at all. This data point is a little maybe skeptical, depending on who actually answered the survey. But from the results, 9 people identified the yellow trailer as being one of their favorite fights. I had to include this in the category. The people's favorite fight versus RWBY is RWBY and Juniper versus Giant Nevermore and Deathstalker with 17 votes, as we have already mentioned. And the people's favorite tournament fight was Yang versus Mercury. That was a great fight. I personally liked it a whole lot. However, this also received only 10 votes, so overall, not a lot of the tournament fights were identified as being in the list of people's favorites, but this was the tournament fight with the most votes, obviously, because I put it in the favorite tournament fight category. So next we have favorite fight versus a Salem follower, which was Raven versus Cinder with 26 votes, also the favorite fight of Volume 5. And then I wanted to distinguish it from the favorite main protagonist versus a Salem follower fight, which is Ranger and Crow versus Tyrion with 25 votes. I believe Yang versus Neo in Volume 2 also had 25 votes, but Neo is pretty much only loyal to Roman and hung out with him. I'm sure she didn't care much about Salem at all, so I didn't put that in this category. Now we're going to discuss which social media liked which fights. So, Reddit's favorite fight with 20 votes was Blake and Yang versus Adam. So 20 of the 40-something people who responded on Reddit identified this fight as being in their list of favorites. Facebook's favorite fight was the food fight with 15 votes. And Twitter's favorite fight was also Blake and Yang versus Adam with 14 votes. So far, these are all pretty much individual fights and don't say too much about the qualities of fights in each volume over time. I just thought it'd be fun to do some categories. And on the next pages, I will show the comparisons between volumes and finally get to the meat of the question: have the fights really gotten worse in the eyes of the community? And I didn't write my own analyses and results on this document, so this paragraph is a lie. Let me know what you think on Twitter, at my handle. Blah, 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 blah. I know this looks super blurry, you might not be able to read it super well, especially after I render this video, but basically all you need to know is this pie chart is all of the volumes fights that were part of people's answers put together, and then I took the fights with at least 5 or more votes and put them in a pie chart. So basically I took all the fights with 5 or more votes, got the total number of votes from that subset of data, and made it into a pie chart. So, and it's colored by volume, so that's really all you need to know. You don't need to read the individual pie pieces. So red is volume 1, light blue is volume 2, purple is volume 3, the orangish is volume 4, the bright yellow is volume 5, and the pink is volume 6. So you can kind of get a feel for where, in which volumes, people's most favorite fights are. I have the percentages, so the total volume percentages: volume 1, 14%, volume 2, 27%, volume 3, 18%, volume 4, 10%, volume 5, also 10%, and volume 6 had 24%. So this is all the combined social medias. I'll break them down into their individual ones in a minute, but also note that I did this on Excel. For some reason, the numbers on the pie chart automatically got rounded, so if you added up those total volume percentages, it actually adds up to 103%, but it should give you a decent idea of where the distribution is. So this next pie chart is essentially the same thing, however, it's also including all responses, even if they had less than 5 votes, but those that had less than 5 votes are combined into a single, volume 1 other, or volume 2 other category / pie piece. So I wanted to see if the fights that less people had on their favorites would change the data at all. It changed very little, however, as you can see in the pie chart and the volume percentages. Volume 1, 14, volume 2, 26, volume 3, 17, volume 4, 10, volume 5, 11, and volume 6, 23. So volume 6 actually went down 1%, volume 5 went up 1%, for example. That is because of stuff like someone identified the Haven main floor battle as their favorite, so that contributes to the volume 5 other category, etc, etc, etc. Now we're gonna get into each social media's favorite fights. I like pie charts. I think they look pretty cool. Can you tell? So for Reddit, the volume with most favorites was volume 6 with 27% of the votes. 51% of total votes were from volumes 1 through 3, however, and 49% were from volumes 4 through 6. So this is actually a pretty good balance. People on Reddit seem to like both halves, because we're at 6, so half is 3, both halves of RWBY so far in terms of fights, but 27% of the votes were for volume 6, so that means over a quarter of favorite fights of RWBY were actually in volume 6. If that makes any sense. Similar with volume 3, which had 23%. However, I also thought it might be important to identify / distinguish volumes that Monty worked on, aka volumes 1 and 2, and see if those had a huge percentage, and just using that to compare, were Monty's fights better in the eyes of the community? I don't know. I'm just looking at the data, so yeah. So here are the results for Reddit. Volume 6 and volume 3 seem to be Reddit's favorites, with volume 2 behind that, and then volume 4 and volumes 1 and 5 being the least favorite on Reddit. For Twitter and Facebook in a second, we start seeing some differences. So the volume with the most favorites on Twitter was volume 2 with 30% of the vote, which is actually super big in this case. So 62% of favorite fights were from volumes 1 through 3, the first half of the show, and 38% of favorite fights were from volume 4 through 6. So that is vastly, it depends on how you define vastly, but it is significantly different from Reddit's results. And 48% of favorite fights were from volumes Monty worked on, volumes 1 to 2, and you can see there's a big chunk of the pie at volume 2, so that includes like the great fights like Yang versus Neo, stuff like that. And I think people on Twitter really liked those fights. Obviously, because 30% of responses included a volume 2 fight. So finally, Facebook's favorite volume for fights was also volume 2 with 27% of the vote. 61% of Facebook's favorites were from volumes 1 through 3, and I believe, is that the highest? It's about the same as Twitter. So 61% of Facebook's favorites were from volumes 1 through 3, and 39% of favorites were from volumes 4 through 6, and 44% of favorites on Facebook were from volumes Monty worked on, again, volumes 1 through 2. Finally, this might be a bit of a controversial graph, I don't know, I thought it would be good to visualize something like this, and it goes back to the main question: have the fights not been as good as they were before? Have the fights gotten worse in the eyes of the community, etc., etc.? I made a fight quality in quotes, over time graph. Before we get into it, I just want to put a disclaimer, and I'll say this again in a second. This does not reflect my interpretation of a fight's quality, and again, like I said at the beginning, I asked what people's favorite fights were. I made an assumption that people would have a fight as their favorite if it was better in quality. Also, like I said before, I understand the confounding variables of emotional investment in a fight that might not necessarily have the best fight quality, but I basically ignored that for the sake of this survey. So, getting into it, I plotted fight quality in quotes over time, and based on the data I received from my survey, it shows that volume 2 overall from all 100 respondents was the favorite volume for fights, and volumes 4 and 5 had the lowest quality in quotes fights, but volume 6 is very close overall to being as good as volume 2 in fight quality in quotes. It looks like a kind of trig curve in a way. I don't know, I thought it looked cool. So you can see volume is on the x-axis, percent of total favorites on the y-axis. Here I use the term fight quality for simplicity. It simply represents change over volumes for the percentage of fights that are included in the community's favorites. So my reasoning was, if a fight has high quality, more people are likely to have it as one of their favorites. So hopefully that makes a lot of sense to you guys. It was the easiest way for me to do this survey, especially because I have real life responsibilities. So I couldn't spend a whole lot of time analyzing data and all kinds of variables for this survey. So this graph above, which I'm about to go back to, does not in any way represent my opinion of fight choreography, pacing, etc. Finally, from this graph, while it is very simple and does not cover a very extended period of time, 10 years plus, it still shows that the community tends to favor fights from volume 2 the most in general. However, volume 6 is very close behind, and volume 4 had the least favorite fights overall, though volume 5 was only just above volume 4 in terms of favorites. So I'm kind of looking at my screen right now. If I divide this graph down the middle, there are more higher points in the first half of the show than the second half. However, like I said, volume 6 definitely represented an increase in favorites in the community. To kind of give an answer to my question of have the fights really gotten worse over time, I would say, you can make your own conclusions and let me know what you guys think, but I would say if you don't count volume 6, which just happened, then there would be a steady decline in fight quality since the first half of the show. Especially volume 2, which was a volume Monty worked on and had great fights. However, according to the people who responded to my survey, they really liked volume 6 fights, so that contradicts what some of the community is saying, that the fights still are bad. It doesn't totally give me an answer as to whether or not the people who say the fights are still bad even after volume 6 is a vocal minority or not. It doesn't give me a definite answer, but from the people who happened to respond to my survey, it does seem like volume 6 was definitely a step up in quality, and the fights have gotten better, almost as good as volume 2, which had the most favorite fights overall. So So, that about concludes the results of my RWBY Favorite Fights Survey 2019. I will give y'all access to the full document. Also, the last page of the document contains my raw data, like spreadsheets and actual numbers of votes and stuff. So if anyone wants to see that, here's the link to the Google spreadsheet thing. Y'all can see it. Y'all ain't gonna edit it or nothing, and I'll also hopefully try to remember to put that link in the description if y'all ever want to go back and look at this and analyze data yourself. Do whatever, that's fine. Just don't hack into my account and mess with the document, whatever. But yeah, thank you to everyone who responded on my survey. It was actually really cool, and it was fun to like make graphs and be sciencey with a topic that actually had little to nothing to do with my schoolwork that I'm usually doing. So if y'all have any questions, or for whatever reason want me to do another survey, I don't know. If y'all thought this was interesting or whatever, just please leave a comment. Like, I love comments, and I definitely want to know what y'all thought of this. I don't have much more to say, so I think I'm just gonna end this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks to everyone who responded to the survey, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye!